In this part, I want to talk about a really important part of tkinter, and that is creating custom components. What that means is, to use tkinter or literally any GUI framework efficiently, you need to be able to create your own components. For example, when we use the classes in the last bit, we have created a couple of custom widgets. One example was the entry widget. What we created looked like this. And what is really important here is that this entire thing was one frame that we customized. So we gave it a label with a background and a button. And once we have that, we could create this multiple times. So we had another label and another button. Besides that, we also created this entire side panel as a separate widget. I suppose I should look at all of this in code straight away. Here's the code of what we just covered before. And all of this gives us this kind of app. The really important thing you have to understand here is that we are creating custom widgets. This entry here inherits from frame and adds more stuff to it. So this frame here. This we can do multiple times. We have one frame and we have another frame. This one here. Both of these were very easily created. We did all of that inside of main. In here, we can simply create one entry and another entry. I could duplicate this again, add entry 3, button 3, and for the color, I could go with green. If I run this thing now, we have a third entry widget. With this kind of system, we can create more complex layouts fairly easily and also keep them more manageable, which is why it is really important that you understand how to use all of this. I'm going to practice it in this video as well, but definitely play around with this in your own time. Although more importantly for this video, what I also want to cover is that there are two ways to create custom components. The first one we have already seen is by using classes. Inside of a class, you inherit a widget and you add custom parts to it. This can create really complex layouts, but the downside is if you end up with too many small bits, you might have a ton of classes, which would be a bit annoying to manage. To account for that, we have the second approach, and that is a more functional approach. All we are doing in here is we are creating a widget inside of a function and then return the widget. This is a bit more limited in terms of what we can do, but the upside is we can create lots of small components inside of a class. Basically what you want to do, for any more complex component, you want to use a class. But inside of this more complex component, you want to use the functional approach to create simpler bits. All of this is going to make much more sense when we actually make the app. Speaking of which, what we're going to make is going to look something like this. In here, we have a couple of custom components. The most important one is each of those rows is one widget, and all of those are made using classes. Inside of this, we have 3 columns. We have a label, we have a button, and then we have this kind of thing with an entry and a button. For this final bit here, I want to use the functional approach. For the simple reason that this isn't particularly complicated. We simply have a frame with 2 widgets inside. It wouldn't really merit using a whole class, but I also don't want to create too much of a layout inside of the class itself in the init method. But, well, let's jump into the code and let's have a look at all of this. Once again, I already have a couple of lines of code ready. If I execute the entire thing, we have a basic window with a title, but not much else. With that, we have to figure out how to create this kind of thing. What I want to start with is that these rows are always one widget, and this I want to create by using a class, which means I want to get started by creating a class, and this I want to call segment. I guess is a good name. This has to inherit from ttk.frame. Inside of this, I want to create a dunder init method. This one needs self, we need a parent, on top of that we need a label text, and we are going to need a button text. That way I can customize the entire thing quite a bit easier. For reference, once again, inside of each segment I have a label and I have a button. Once I have that, I can actually create the widget itself. For that, we first of all have to run this super init method, and set the master to the parent. With that, we basically have a frame. And essentially what I want to do, inside of the global scope, I want to create all of the widgets. The important point here is I only want to call the segment, and tkinter, or more specifically the class itself, should take care of everything else. All I want to pass inside of the segment is the parent, which is the window. Then I want to have a label text. Let's go with label. And I want to have a button text, button. And that is it. I don't want to do anything else inside of the global scope. The entire logic of this widget should be inside of this segment. That way, we have one component that takes care of everything, and we don't have to think about it too much. What this allows us to do is duplicate this a couple of times, and we have different widgets that can do different things. For example, in this case, we would have different labels, let's say button and click, or hello and test. It doesn't really matter what you place in here. The important thing that you have to understand is that we are creating a custom component that contains a huge amount of logic. To get started in all of this, inside of the segment class, I want to create a grid layout. For that, I want to get self and row configure. Although for this one, I want to have row 0 with a weight of 1, and that's basically it. Although with that, I can duplicate the entire thing, change the row to a column. Instead of a 0, I want to have 0, 1, and 2. I want to have 3 columns that all have the same weight. On top of that, I also want to set uniform to A, or it doesn't really matter what it is, but with this, all of the columns are going to have the same size, or more specifically the same width. Inside of this, I can now create a TTK label, and I can create a TTK button. Both are going to need fairly similar arguments. The first one is the parent. That is going to be self. Besides that, we also need text. This text we already have because we have the label text and we have the button text. For the label, I want to have the label text. For the button, I want to have the button text. After I have that, I want to use the grid method to place both of the widgets. The label is going to be in row 0 and column 0 as well. All of this I can copy as well, because the button is also going to be in row 0, but column is going to be 1. If I run the entire thing, we can see that we, cannot see anything. The reason for that is that this segment is not being placed on the window, which means we have created a component, but we are not placing it. For that, we need, a placement method. And this, once again, we can do inside of the component itself. All I have to do inside of the init method is self, and then use one of the layout methods. I'm going to go with pack. With that, we can see the different layouts. Although right now, all of this looks a tiny bit weird. So not ideal yet. First of all, I want to set this to expand being true, and fill should be both. Now if I run this, this is starting to look a little bit better. Although I need a few more widgets to make all of this look halfway decent. That we can do very easily, because to create more widgets, all I have to do is duplicate this segment, and we get more widgets. Although I'm going to change the text here, so we can see a bit better what's going on. I will just add random words in here. It really doesn't matter what you add here. It's just for illustration anyway. Let's say exit, and now we have 5 different segments. This still isn't terribly visible because there's so much white space in here. The reason for that is that both of the label and the button only take up the minimum amount of space that I need to display the text. That we can change by using the sticky argument. And I want to set sticky to north, south, east, and west. Now if I run this, all of this starts to come together much better. What you can also do is inside of this pack method, set pad x to 10 pixels, and pad y should also be 10 pixels. If I run this now, we have a tiny bit of white space between the widgets. And that is basically it. I don't want to repeat myself too much here, but what we have done is we have created a custom component called segment, and inside of the segment, we have a ton of logic. That way, inside of the global scope, this bit here, we can simply create one component, and this component creates something much more complex in the app. Just imagine if we didn't have this kind of setup. We would have to create this code up here 5 different times. And if we wanted to update any individual bit, let's say this hello here, we would have to go through a lot of code just to find this one part, which would be really annoying to work with. But in our setup here, all of this is very easily manageable, which is why you really have to understand this. Now, this is one way to create this kind of layout system. There is another way though. What we have done for now is we have used a class-based approach to organize our widgets. But this we don't have to do. We could also use a functional approach. Let's have a look at this one by translating our class-based approach to a functional one. Back in the app, I want to, all the way at the top, create a function. I'm going to call this one create segment. This one is going to need 3 different arguments. We need the parent, we need a label text, and we need a button text. For the keen-eyed among you, those are the same parameters we have used here. We don't need self because we're not using a class. Inside of this function, we are basically trying to recreate all of this and then return the result. Basically what that means is I want to create a frame, which is just going to be ttk and frame. At the end of the function, I want to return that frame, which essentially means that we are taking this frame here, except now we are keeping it by itself. Although, first of all, we have to set a master for the frame, which is going to be the parent we are passing into the function, this parent here. Next up, we have to create the layout, this grid layout here. I suppose I could just copy the entire thing, paste it in here, and fix the white space. We don't have self anymore. Instead, we want to set the frame with rows and columns. After that, I want to create some widgets. I suppose I should be a bit better here with the comments. What we have done in the class-based approach was also creating widgets. That way all of this is a bit easier to read. In my case, I want to copy all of this and paste it inside of the functional approach. Now we have a TTK label and a TTK button. Although, once again, we don't have self anymore. Instead, I want to parent them to the frame we created up here. With that, we have the same thing we created inside of the segment here. Which means now that we are returning it, we can simply use it. Which means all of this here, I want to comment out. And if I run this, we can't see any widget anymore. And let me minimize the class. Now you can see roughly the entire app. Instead of using a segment, I want to create segment. And for the arguments, I have to get the parent, the label text, and the button text. These 3 arguments. If I run this now, we still can't see anything, because what we have done inside of this function is create a widget, but we are not placing it. This we could have done inside of the segment very easily, because in here, we could simply run self.pack. This, unfortunately, we cannot do inside of the frame, because we are returning the frame, we couldn't place it right away. Although what we can do, since this function here is returning a widget, we can, on it, run a layout method, like pack for example. And this pack could be expand true and fill both, like so. And now if I run this, we can see we have 1 widget. Although since we only have 1, all of this looks a bit weird, but what I can do now is simply copy all of this. Let me add some white space, uncomment it. And instead of a segment, I want to use my function create segment. Since we're using the same arguments, all of this should still work. Also, don't forget, we have to add the pack method to all of them. Like so. And now if I run this, we have the same result. Although I did forget one thing, and that is the padding for X and for Y. Let me copy it from the segment class and paste it inside all of them, so we get exactly the same result. Now if I run this, we have exactly the same result. And we have done all of this by using either a function or a class. Both would be fine in this instance because we are creating something fairly simple. But once again, I want to emphasize, if you want to create more complex layouts, having either something like this or something like this, let me uncomment it, is much easier to understand and to maintain than having a ton of widgets that you all create manually. For future videos, I am going to rely a lot more on custom components, so this is an important thing to understand. Which means let's do an exercise, and I hope you can still keep up. All we have to do is an exercise, and then we are done. What I want you guys to do is create a smaller widget inside of the segment class using a function or a method. Specifically, inside of this segment class, I want you guys to use a function to create another widget, like we have done up here. Instead now, don't use a function, use a method inside of this class. What you should be doing is create a container that has an entry field and a button stacked on top of each other. The button should be set via the parameters, and all of this should be inside of the third column of this segment. As a reminder, we are creating 3 columns, and right now we are only using column 0 and column 1. At the end of this, all of this should look something like this. We have an entry field and we have a button. For all of my buttons, I use the text exercise, but this should be more customizable. Pause the video now and try to figure this one out yourself. Alright, let's get started. I want to work inside of the segment again. Although, first of all, what I should do is comment out all of these functions, because I only want to work with the segment class. Inside of this one, I want to create a method. Let me call it create exercise box. For this one, we need 2 arguments. We need self, like for any method, and then I want to have some text. This is going to be the button text. Now, inside of this method, we have to create a frame. Like we have done up here with create segment, we always start by creating a frame. And this frame we are returning at the end. Although this frame, while being ttk and frame, has a parent of self, or a master to be a bit more specific. At the end of this method, I want to return this frame. Although before we are doing that, I want to create a ttk entry. This one is going to have the parent of frame. And besides that, I want to have a ttk button. This one has frame as the parent, but also text is going to be the text that we are getting from the parameters. This text up here, we are passing in here. Once we have that, we have to place both of these widgets inside of the frame. And this I want to do with the pack method. Since both of the widgets are supposed to be on top of each other, I don't need a side, but I do want to set expand to true and fill to both. And that is all I need inside of this method. With that, I can minimize it. Now, inside of the widgets, I can call self.create exercise box and add the text in here. For now, let's go with exercise. If I run the entire thing now, we still can't see anything because once again, I forgot that we have only created a widget, we haven't placed it yet. For that, we need the grid layout method. So grid, I want to have a row 0 and column should be 2. On top of that, I want to set sticky to north, south, east, and west, and that should cover it all. Meaning if I run this now, here we have a pretty good looking result. We have an entry field and we have an exercise button. I hope you can see the value of this, because now inside of this class, when we are creating the widgets, we have all of this in a fairly logical layout. We are creating a label, a button, and then an exercise box. Now, this exercise box could be a separate class. That would be perfectly fine. But since it is so simple, it's only 4 lines of code, you don't really have to do that. It's kind of an overkill. Which means in this case, simply using a method to create something slightly more complex is perfectly fine and much easier to maintain. Although there's one more thing I do want to do, and that is that right now we always use exercise for the text for the button. But this I want to have a bit more customizable. So when I'm creating this segment, I want to have another parameter, and that is going to be the exercise text. This exercise text I'm going to pass into this function, like so. And now when I'm creating all of these segments, I have to add one more argument. Let's go with test just to see if this is working. And there we go. Now we have test for all of these buttons. I could change this. The first one could be test. The next one could be something else. Then we have 1, 2, 3. We could also have an empty button, or we could have end. It doesn't really matter. But now we have different kinds of text in here, and everything is still very easily maintainable. All of the customization happens in here, and this is very easy to see and very easy to understand. And if you want to make changes, you have all of this contained inside of one class that is maintainable and very easy to work with.